Okay, we're back. Level One Coach Podcast, episode 4 of season 3. We are going to talk about feedback loops. I think we're going to get into a little bit of fear and the finite game versus the infinite game. So I'll kick it over to you.
So yeah, at the end of the last episode, we started to get into feedback loops and we kind of grazed the surface of how sometimes you need a longer timeline than maybe you are given or not always you're given, but just you need a longer timeline than the one that is currently being evaluated on. And so we were talking about with our team a book and pre-scouts, and we were using that as kind of the analogy. And then in the 7 days since we've last recorded, there was a relatively major event within the NHL, and a a firing, and then a different hiring, which I'll let you get into. But I think it speaks to for certain the firing aspect speaks to the longer infinite game and the longer feedback loop. So I'll let you jump into that from there.
Yeah, so just to kind of retouch on feedback loops, um, give you a couple examples. Like a short feedback loop would be a shift in a hockey game. Um, if there's a plan in place or if there's you get a puck on your stick and there's a choice and execution that goes along with that. Did you make the play? Did you not make the play? And then you can break that down further from like breaking down the execution of it to breaking down the choice. Was it a good choice? Was it not a good choice? And those like binary yes no um, things would be short feedback loops that happen relatively quickly. And a longer feedback loop, we gave the example last episode, your team reading extreme ownership. And when are those behaviors going to start to take hold? Is it going to be immediate? Is it going to be, is it going to reach a critical mass of players where you start seeing things in 6 months, within the first year, going into the second year now that you guys are doing it? Um, so that would be a little bit of a longer term feedback loop. And when you look at the Buffalo Sabres, and I started to study them and track them when Granato took over because I love Don Granato. I think he is an outside the box thinker. That's why I'm attracted to him. But he was just willing to do things that most other coaches at the highest level weren't willing to go there. And if you're going to commit, which Buffalo originally did in his hiring to the infinite game, then you have to realize what you're dealing with a Don Granato. So, not to go too far down the rabbit hole of the power versus force thing, but like Don calibrates over 540, unconditional love. He's above the critical level of 200. So he would be in the power category. Whereas Lindy Ruff right now, who's taking over, calibrates under 20. That is force all day. And there's differences there. But without getting too bogged down into that, the thing with power, and it can also be referred to in the context we're using it as, is the infinite game, which more people will be familiar with. Power takes time. And there's typically an intentional process and an intentional system behind what's going on. And you can think back to Sam Hinkie, the 76ers. We talked about that in the last episode. So if you're going to commit to that, and Buffalo wasn't a team when he took over that were like on the cusp of the playoffs or on the cusp of greatness. He took over a team that was at the bottom of the league table, and that's going to take time. So a longer feedback loop is going to be required. And like the NHL is very short-sighted look around. The guy that just took over, for example, got a 2-year contract. And sure, the team is further along than when Don Granato took over, so maybe he can put up or shut up in 2 years. But 3 years, which is what Don Granato got, is not enough time to take your team from the basement of the NHL to the playoffs, unless the stars really align. And let me just stop there for right now if you have thoughts on that. And then if you want to go further in a certain direction, let me know.
I think I think what I find interesting about this this situation with Granato and like you said, you've studied them and looked into that organization and him a lot more than I have. So I'm kind of speaking maybe just off of hunch and what I've seen from an outsider's perspective without having a ton of information on the inside. Um, but like I guess it all comes back to like how you measure success. If you measure success as making the playoffs and winning a Stanley Cup and that's it, then like yes, Don Granato failed and he failed 3 years in a row and thus he should be out. If you measure success as like building towards something and incremental improvement, and you are thinking as an owner or GM or whoever's making these decisions within Buffalo and then any NHL team for that matter, if you are thinking like, I don't, you brought this up last episode with Sam Hinkie, like, we don't need to win a Stanley Cup or an NBA championship in year 3, but we need to be in the hunt for one by year 10. And we need to consistently be knocking on the door year after year after year once we set all of this like culture foundation in place. And if you measure success by that standard, then like was Don Granato successful in Buffalo? No one will ever be able to answer that question, I think, honestly, because you didn't give him enough time. You gave him 3 years. And think about, like you said, like Buffalo was not exactly in great shape when he got there. And I'm just looking very surface level right now. But like a stat that is always talked about within the NHL is regulation and overtime wins, ROW, because it's not I believe that's what it stands for, right? Yeah. It's not shootout wins. So in theory, it's harder to win, regulation or OT. Buffalo had 37 of those. They had 38, 39 wins as a team overall. The point is that Washington, who was the second wild card team to make it in, and New York, who was the last team in the Metropolitan to make it in. They had 38 and 36 regulation overtime wins. So my point is Buffalo was like they were right there. One more than Washington, one less than the Islanders. Like I understand they missed the playoff by 7 points. I understand they didn't make the playoffs, I don't believe, in the last 3 years. But they weren't I'll throw where I'm from under the bus. They weren't the Blue Jackets who weren't even knocking on anything, not even close. And so there's that part of it. And the second part of it for me is you hired Don Granato. You didn't like Don Granato was not forced upon you. No one said, I guess I don't technically know the the ins and outs, but you chose to bring in a guy like this. He was an assistant first, and then you promoted him to head coach in the middle of the season, I think 4 seasons ago. So you chose to use this guy as your head coach, to hire this guy. You knew the game he plays or the game he was going to play. Like this wasn't a shock. So I look at like the Sam Hinkie thing in the 76ers, like as far as I know, he chose to leave on his own, which to me is very different. Like he chose to remove himself, not and who knows, maybe the owners were like trying to oust him and maybe that was part of the reason he left because people weren't really down with what he was doing. But I look at this and I wonder like did you ever stop? And when I say you, whether it's GM, owners, whoever's making a decision for Buffalo, like I said, like, did you ever stop and think like, man, like we're in the middle of this like big thing that Don was talking about us needing to do. You brought up the Red Wings in the last episode as well, and how they haven't quite gotten to the point where they're like knocking on Stanley Cups and back to the heydays of them being in the playoffs every year, but they are really damn close. And I would imagine Yzerman has a similar message to what he had in Tampa of like this thing is going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. If we want to get the pieces in place to do it consistently and build, you do need to give that time. And I look at that and I'm like, for Buffalo, like you knew the game that you were playing with Don Granato, and you chose to take him out of the equation, and then you brought someone in who, again, outsider perspective, from what I can tell, he ain't gonna play that game. And what's that gonna do to the players that are there now and coaches that are there now and the philosophy that has been built or the principles that have been um kind of like expounded upon over the last 3 years. It's just like, does all of it go to waste? Like, I don't know. But it's frustrating from an outsider perspective again, just to see that and think like that's another example of a feedback loop that was just too long for people to really entertain it. And like that's all controllable, I guess, is where I find it the most frustrating.
Yeah, the analogy that I gave, and I I'll just start with it. Um, Buffalo decided, and when any team, whether it's the Red Wings right now, a couple other teams committed to it, Tampa in the past, like if you're committed to playing the infinite game, you're running in one direction. So let's say that direction is east. And Buffalo chose for 3 years to run east. And let's say they made it 60 miles. You don't just get to teleport back to the beginning of wherever the midpoint or the starting point was. So then you can now run west with Lindy Ruff because Lindy Ruff is different and Lindy Ruff is force, whereas Don Granato was power. Lindy Ruff is finite, where Don Granato was infinite. So you don't just get to teleport back to the beginning and start running west. You have to take where you are right now, which is 60 miles east, and start getting back to zero. So then you can go in Lindy Ruff's direction. And then you give him a 2-year contract. So you're going to undo all that when you're already this far down a path. Good luck. Let me kick it to you for thoughts on that.
What comes to mind for me is like you have, I mean, I just kind of brought them up and it's an unfortunate example because they were obviously outside factors this past year, but like being from Ohio, like Columbus is a great example of this, where like they never allow themselves to have whatever it may be, 5, 6, 7 years of one coach and just like and not even one coach, like one philosophy, and just try to build upon that. Because like you said, like you don't have the ability to just, hey, like your analogy is perfect. Like you went 60 miles east. You don't just today with Lindy Ruff in place. You don't just start back to mile zero. You are still at 60. Now you are going to have to unteach or unlearn these things that you learned in the last 3 years before you can start going in Lindy Ruff's direction. And a lot of times, I think that's why it's hard in the first place to build and to improve, because whatever you take over, you're usually trying to undo for the first year or two before you can move in your direction. And with this example, it's like you hope that Lindy Ruff doesn't maybe undo some of the things that Granato was doing. But even if he does, and even if the direction that Lindy Ruff wants to go and let's say needs to go in order for them to have success, let's say that the direction that Lindy Ruff wants to go will lead to a Stanley Cup. Okay, you're still not setting him up for success because now he's going to have to go undo the things that were done the last 3 years and move to that direction, move towards his direction. And it brings me back to like I guess just like when you're making these decisions, like do you consider do you consider that doing nothing might be just as beneficial as doing something? Like I know that that would require steadfast belief in what you're doing, and it would require a lot, or it would entail taking a lot of heat because media and all that would be like, oh my God, Buffalo doesn't care. What are they doing? But could you just do nothing and for 3 more years see if anything better comes about? And I'll give one example that I have told you off air, and it's like my favorite quote of all time with coaching. And it was someone that coached in Division 3 said this a couple of years ago to me when I was just starting out, and they had been in one place for 8 years, and after their fourth year, they had what was definitely not the year that he thought they would have. He's a head coach, Division 3, and after 4 years, sorry, after the fourth year, that fourth season didn't go so well. Under 500, I can't remember if they missed playoffs, but if they made playoffs, it wasn't a high seed. And he was saying that if he worked in Division 1 at that time, there's no way he's re-signing after his fourth year. Like he would have been gassed. And he works in Division 3. It doesn't necessarily operate like that. And he signed, I don't even know that I don't know that he signed a 4 year deal. I think he just had more years anyways. And so now, sitting there after 8 years was when this conversation took place. In those next 4 years, years 5, 6, 7, and 8, the team had rattled off like a 72 win percentage. So his point was like in the 4 years that I never get if this were Division 1, we had the most success that I've ever had here, and probably way more success than I actually thought we would. If I'm only given those first 4 years and then I lose my job, I never am known, in Division 1 as a coach that can successfully bring a team to a championship or have a team be a consistent contender. I'm never considered that because I didn't do it in the 4 years that I got the opportunity to. Um, I'll stop there because I think that gets my point across.
The word that comes to mind, and I was thinking about it yesterday before you brought this example up, but it's a great one. They're all of life, and especially in like coaching or team success, it's non-linear. And we talked at the beginning that it is incremental yardage and it is small gains until it's not. And then there's that quantum leap or this non-linear jump that you just talked about with that coach in the example. You go from being just building, 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 not very good, not very good, okay, getting better, decent. And then the last phase of that is a 72% win percentage for 4 years. So non-linear comes to mind. And then the other word, as you were talking, that comes to mind is being the exception. I guess it's a phrase, not a word, but being the exception. And like to be exceptional, you have to be the exception. And right now, the exception at the highest level is choosing to play the infinite game. It's what Tampa did. It's what the 76ers did in the NBA while everyone was laughing at them. It's what the Red Wings are doing now under the same GM that was in Tampa. And that is not the norm. The norm is here's a 2 year contract. Here's a 4 year contract in Division 3. Like your last example, figure it out. And if you don't, we'll find someone else. And choosing to be the exception at the highest level is literally committing steadfastly to something that you have conviction in. And when you're a Steve Yzerman right now, or when you were Kevin Adams before he hired Don Granato, and when you are Sam Hinkie, there's a difference between this isn't working and this isn't working yet. And it's the same thing in your last example with the Division 3 school. This isn't working was for 4 years. And if you're not in Division 3 and you don't have a longer term mindset and you don't have the confidence and conviction of the AD to just stay with me for a second, it's coming, then it's going to be, this isn't working. And then it's just done. But if your mindset is, this isn't working yet, but we're trending, Buffalo's win percentage improved and their ROW improved every year. Detroit's has improved every year in their process. The 76ers improved in their process. So if you can be in the mindset that We just haven't made the nonlinear jump. We just haven't made the quantum leap yet, but we're compounding this advantage. Then you can stick with what you believe in. But I think, and this might be a good transition, like if you're going to like live in the fear or succumb to that attractor energy field of fear from the outside, whether it's from the media, whether it's from your owner, whether it's from whoever. Like if you're going to listen to the voices start to get loud. Um, if you have thoughts on that, if you want to dip your toe into the water of fear.
Well, the nonlinear thing, like it's exactly what this is. It doesn't
Mhm.
we are so and it's there's no one person who is to blame for this. It's simple geometry, algebra, I don't know. But you're taught that like lines just go straight up. So every year you just get a little bit better, get a little bit better. What you don't recognize is like that doesn't mean that like take it just take it as a player. It doesn't mean that freshman year you're gonna have 5 points and then sophomore 10 and then junior 20 and then senior 30. Like you might have freshman sophomore year 7 and 8 and then junior senior have 36 and 45. Like because you figured out the level and then all of a sudden you pop. Like it's the same kind of idea with this where like well, before I even move on from that, how many players are given up on after their sophomore year because they all haven't done it yet. So we should have a new freshman come in and try to take that role instead of can this guy do it as a junior? He hasn't yet, but could he get there? Um, so that's we're not going there today, but that is also true with the players. But with this, it's like I as you were talking, I was just curious with Jared Bednar in Colorado. And like so his first year in Colorado, they went 22 and 56 and obviously missed the playoffs with that record. That was just year one, I understand. Now the next 4 years that he's there, they have great regular season records, or I shouldn't say great, but above 500, 43 wins, 38, 42, 39. They lose in the first or second round 4 years in a row.
Mhm.
If you are consistently making the playoffs and losing in the first or second round, the voices that you mentioned earlier, they're telling you you're failing. You're not good enough. You're not doing a good job. Believe Joe Sakic, GM there, correct?
I think so.
So Sakic, whoever, playing a little longer game, using a different timetable than the rest of society. The very next year, after 4 years of first or second round losses, they go 56 and 19 in the regular season and win the Stanley Cup. How many coaches do the exact same thing that Jared Bednar did and get fired after that fifth year? Because now he's been there 5 years. He's never advanced to the conference finals. He's never made it to the Stanley Cup finals. He's got Nate McKinnon, Gabe Landeskog, Mikko Rantanen, Cale Makar. He's loaded, like his roster's loaded. This guy doesn't need a fifth year. He's had four. He hasn't done it yet.
Mhm.
And now in year five, he wins the Stanley Cup. And then, now he's in year seven and like who knows what'll happen. But now I'm fired up because when you look at this, like it is not it is not to say that that's the only way to be successful, is to just give everybody 10 years. But outside of wins and losses, there are other metrics and other ways to track incremental improvement and find out, are we getting there? Are we moving towards something? Are we are we trending in the right direction? And are we poised to make a jump, like you talked about a quantum leap? Are we poised to do that, or are we screwed? And I genuinely believe that too often there are teams, organizations that really are poised to make that leap. And Buffalo is bringing it back to them is such a good example right now. Like I don't pretend to know all the players on their team, but with Owen Power and some of like the young guys that they've drafted, like you can't tell me they're gonna miss the playoffs every year for the next 5 years. Like they're just not with those ball players that they have on the roster. So like they're gonna figure it out, and you just rip the rug from underneath them now. Um, and at the end of the day, bringing it back to kind of where you left it with the voices, like at the end of the day, those voices whether that's media, whether it's like hockey personalities, like, and not that any of them are necessarily relevant to this, but the Elliot Friedmans and Darren Dragers and all those guys that talk, like they have a lot of knowledge, but they're not on the inside. So the only people that know if Buffalo is really trending in the right direction are the players, the members of the coaching staff, and then hopefully the GM and the owners. But outside of that, like no one knows enough to really make an assessment. And I'll say one thing unrelated to this, but it was relevant. There was a coach in Division One talking about a player of his this year just the other day, and the player had an exceptional year in Division One, and he said something on behalf of him accepting an award that like there were a lot of comments made from the media about this player that were really unfair, and he was able to have the season he did in Division One despite the comments that were being made about him. And you think about like being on the outside, you think about like that noise. And like for you or I, it's truly noise. It's just a guy on Twitter spouting off about how the Sabres suck. But when you're like on the inside, like that does affect you. You do hear those things or see those things. And when this coach was talking about a player of his that's obviously young in college, but even for a guy like Don Granato, I don't care how old he is or how many years he's been doing this, like that stuff does affect you or at least has the potential to affect you. And it makes me think like how many people in this kind of setup that we have going that are on the outside that don't really know the inner workings that ultimately affect a lot of decisions because the perception they put out is that Buffalo needs to, it's an article from The Athletic that says, "Is it time to get rid of blank?" question mark. And it's like, I know it's not you saying that they need to fire him, but you're putting that out into the universe.
Mhm.
And I don't know, like my point is that just like those voices, as knowledgeable as they may be in as many years as they may have covered individual teams or sports, they're still not on the inside working with that organization. So for them, it's no different than you or I saying that the Detroit Red Wings need to do blank or the Anaheim Ducks need to do X. Like we don't actually know. We're not there. I've never been in their facility once. I don't see what's going on a daily basis. So I think that's the point is that like only those on the inside working with the organization or there on a daily basis truly know what is going on. And that gets back to like overnight success. Like it's not overnight. Those people that have been there day in and day out know what they're building. But I think a lot of times we listen to the voices on the outside and what they think should happen and what they believe is going on. And yeah, it's just unfortunate, I guess.
Yeah, let's get into fear because I think this is a good. What you're saying kind of leads right into this with the voices and like the fact that it's being written about attention and energy. So that's the whole thing. So fear manifests itself as anxiety. Okay. Fear manifests itself as anxiety. Anxiety, what does that sound like? Pause this, think about it. If you've unpaused this, anxiety sounds like recurring thoughts, repeating thoughts. You can't get the voice that's saying, this isn't working, or you're not good enough, or whatever it is. You can't get that thought out of your head. So anxiety manifests itself as repeating thoughts. Repeating thoughts happen because your mind is actually trying to help you. That was how it was built. So your mind thinks this person can't stop thinking this thought. He must be obsessed with it. So when you were a kid, you and I probably thought about hockey at school, and we weren't listening to our fifth grade algebra teacher. Like I was thinking about Paul Correa highlights and the Mighty Ducks and the Detroit Red Wings. And because I thought of that, I thought about it all the time. So that's the attention and energy link. If you put your attention on something, your brain's like, and you do it repeatedly, your brain goes, let me create a shortcut for this. We're hardwired for shortcuts. Let me just make this easy for you. We'll just think about hockey all the time. Same thing when you flip into fear instead of love. And if all your thoughts are, I'm not good enough. This isn't working. There's outside voices. Elliot Friedman's calling for my job. Um, whatever it is, your brain is hardwired to just keep feeding you that because you're becoming, quote, air quotes, obsessed with that thought, just like the little kid that's obsessed with hockey. So fear in that way becomes self-perpetuating. And the fear ultimately comes from resistance to current reality. So where when you took over the job and you hire an infinite player like Don Granato, and this is where the Chicago Steel have no problem with this. And even though they've changed coaches 3 or 4 times since they started playing the infinite game when Orion Hardy takes over, um, they have no problem because whoever comes in is aligned and they're not going to go back to the beginning. They started running east with Greg Moore. And then when Greg Moore left, Brock Sheehan picked up the baton and he didn't start running west. He just kept running east. And then Brock Sheehan left and Mike Garman picked up the baton and he kept running east. And when you have conviction and you're not listening to the outside voices and you're more obsessed, to use this analogy, if you're more obsessed with compounding your system and playing your game, it's easy to block out. And I know people make excuses and say it's so hard with social media and Twitter. There's a mute button, there's an unfollow button. A lot of these like coaches that I don't know if it's intentionally set up or not, but like the coaches in their own towns on these all or nothing documentaries, when they get in the car and the camera's there, they're listening to sports radio. Like, dude, turn the channel off. And that's how your attention doesn't get on it. And that's how you can compound and play the infinite game in a society and in a industry like the NHL that just doesn't want to. So I'm gonna stop there. There's probably a lot to chew on. Let me know where that took you.
So what I think of is, and this would be totally inverse to what we usually do, but sticking with the Buffalo thing. So if we're saying that Granato was running, actually the Steel is a better example. So they start off, they start out running in one direction with Greg Moore, and then Greg Moore leaves, and they continue running in that same direction. That has seemingly worked, whether it was Brock Sheehan and now I think it's Garmin, but they've continued on in this like same trajectory. Now it's easier to do that because the Steel were having success. So it wasn't like when Moore left, they felt like they needed to do something different. But the general practice is like we went in this way with Granato, it didn't work. Let's go in the other way with Ruff. And then see how long that lasts. But say standard, industry standard, he's given this 3, 4 years, and then he's let go of, and then they bring in someone else. If you could see what we're doing, we're starting here and we're running to the right, and then we're running back to the left, and then we're running back to the right. And like if we started at 0 and we went 20 yards, and we went 20 yards back, we're getting nowhere. We're still starting at that 0 point. What you could do, and this makes me think like, oh my God, this will never happen. But you get rid of a guy like Granato, and then you find a guy that's similar to Granato with a different name. So someone that plays the game the way he does, the infinite game, um, and believes in a lot of the same things he does, and have him come in, and it's like change of face, change of voice. It's a little bit of a fresh perspective, but it's still the same underlying belief and principle. And now let him run with it for the next 20 yards and see if he takes us to 40 instead of back to 0. And I know why that I shouldn't say I know. I think I know why this doesn't happen because you don't believe that you had assume that if you get rid of someone, that means you didn't think they were doing a good job. If you don't think that Don Granato was doing a good job, the last thing you want to do is then go hire someone just like him. But in a lot of ways, it makes me think like maybe you do need that. Maybe that is what you should do. Because then, like I said, you're at least still running the same race towards the same direction that you were running before. Would that ever happen? I mean, probably not, no. And that's okay. I mean, it's okay because I don't have any say in it. And like it's okay because I'm not changing it with anything I say today. But I do I do wonder if you really mapped out, and again, you'd have to be on the inside, like you were saying, but if you mapped out sort of like how often this same sort of scenario plays out where you have someone doing something one way and then you bring in someone, you get rid of them and then you bring in someone else who does it a different way, and let's like you're playing tug of war and we're never pulling over the finish line because we're just tugging it back and forth from one side to the next, keeping it at neutral essentially. um so that's one thing that comes to mind. The other thing just with like the fear, and I haven't really heard anyone outline it the way you did as far as like fear becoming anxiety, which becomes repetitive thoughts. Like it is it is as simple as much as I said those things do affect a guy like Don Granato or whoever. Like at the end of the day, like you do control that. You do control the ability to listen to it. And the easier thing for any coach is to just remove themselves from hearing it than to try to change the whole sports industry and get people to stop talking about it. Um, I think I think the best the best way to do that is quite honestly to just not engage with any of it. And whether that means you don't have social media or you just choose not to look at any of it, like it is very simple to just mute an account or unfollow an account, and then you won't see the things that they're saying all the time. And you know it obviously exists, but you don't know on a daily basis what's being said. And to loop it back to longer feedback loops, like at the end of the day, the guy that's coming at your head on Twitter or Instagram because you haven't won quick enough, um, it's just a feedback loop that they're not allowing to play out the way it should. And if you can understand that, or at least keep that in mind, like, hey, this guy, nothing against me really at the end of the day. He just thinks we should win in year two, and we need to give it year 4 or 5 before we can win. Like there's there's maybe some serenity in knowing that you are doing the right thing. You're just being judged on the wrong timeline.
Yeah. What you said was like the tug of war analogy, or like I put this out yesterday, this tweet storm about Don Granato, but I got one person to reply and was like, essentially what they're doing, and we've given a couple different analogies, and here's a third one supplied by Charlie Mahoney, but Charlie said, like, essentially, Don Granato's style is carrot, and you gave him the carrot, and then you were like, well, the carrot doesn't work, so it has to be the stick next. And it reminds me of this quote that's sitting in front of me that I sent to you from Power vs. Force, and it's current programming in the NHL is what's doing this, and everyone except for the exceptional few that we've mentioned, the Avalanche, the Lightning, the Red Wings are coming. Um, you can keep the receipts on that so long as they don't fire Yzerman, but he believes in it. But it's societal programming. So Hawkins writes in Power vs. Force, societal choices more often than not are the result of expediency, statistical fallacy, sentiment, political or media pressure, or personal prejudice and vested interest. Crucial decisions affecting the lives of everyone on the planet are made under the conditions that virtually guarantee failure. Because societies lack the necessary reality base for formulation of effective problem resolution, they fall back over and over and resort to force, which is extremely costly instead of employing power. Um, you got thoughts on that? Or I can expand on that a little bit.
Can you just read that first line again?
Yeah. Societal choices more often than not are the result of expediency, statistical fallacy, sentiment, political or media pressure, or personal prejudice and vested interest?
I feel like we should have started with that between expediency and societal or political pressure. I mean, that's like everything that we've just said in the last half hour.
Mhm.
Um, and it's crazy that not crazy. It's interesting that this is just not a problem in only sports. It's an issue in probably every industry when you really dive down and look at it deeply. The difference is that the CEO of TD Bank or the chief whatever marketing officer of some other company, like they're not in the spotlight like a Don Granato or Lindy Ruff or any NHL coach or NFL, NBA, whatever sports. You just don't hear about it. But at the end of the day, it's probably happening across any industry that you really look at. And like the pressure of society, the pressure of the media plays into this, but also what I like about that quote is the expediency. Like we just want something so quick. We want this. We don't want to wait. We want this result to happen immediately. And the where I'll go with this, and you can obviously um, circle back to that quote as well. But where I go with this, and this is something that you know a lot more about than I do, is like with fitness or just overall exercise, health, and well-being. Like, how many times do you see, hear, talk to people that are starting a diet and an exercise routine? It's almost like guaranteed every January, someone's starting something new. And the hope is to either lose weight or get in better shape or lean out, whatever it might be. And usually people want results within a month, results within 2 months. And you see these commercials like, oh, guaranteed results in 6 weeks, like whatever it might be. No one wants to wait 6, 8, 9 months and then evaluate, did this work or not for me? That feedback loop is too long. There's no immediate gratification in that. They can't start in January and hit the beach by June and be like, yeah, see, it worked in the last 5 months. And so what ends up happening is they just quit it. They drop it. They go 6 weeks into they call it an exercise routine and diet, and then they don't get the results they want, and so they stop. And then they start something new, or they do nothing for 6 weeks, and then they go back meaning they end up doing damage to themselves or their physical health and well-being because they just neglect everything for 6 weeks. And then they're like, all right, I'll start something new. This one's going to be better. And they hit that one for 6 weeks. And now, like you're talking about, could you have just stuck with the one thing you were doing in the beginning and have done that for, I just used 3 6-week blocks. So for 18 weeks, for let's call it roughly 4.5, 5 months. And would you have seen great results? You just didn't give it enough time. And I say you will know more about this because you obviously worked in the industry as a strength coach and have way more insight into that. So I'll throw that back to you.
Yeah, the question I wrote down is, what if it took you 5 years to make the quantum leap? What if it took you 5 years to get the results that you really want, but there were signposts along the way saying you're making progress? And we're in this world, especially at the highest level, but even in Division 1, with at least the teams that are going to contend every year, they're kind of on the same timeline. And that spills all the way down because we read all these books, like that's spilling down into levels that it just shouldn't. Like a North American Hockey League coach shouldn't be given 3 years to take a team from the basement to the penthouse. And I don't necessarily need to get into that, but like going back to the question to get refocused for myself. What if it took you 5 years to get the quantum leap that you were looking for? And if you knew that you were eventually going to get there, how long are you willing to wait? And right now we're just not willing to wait long enough, except for the teams that are willing to wait long enough. And as you brought up Colorado earlier, something clicked in my head because I was actually looking at the last like probably 10 years of cup winners and like the teams that have just been really good. And sure, you can go Drew Pittsburgh had Sidney Crosby, but the other team that I would include with Tampa and Colorado in the last 10 years is Pittsburgh. And you know who's also been there for a really long time? Their head coach. So if you want to throw like another one into the mix in terms of like the league has been called copycat, but like we're copying all of the teams that aren't winning and like using their tactics over and over and over and over again, which is fire a coach after 3 years. And then we're not copying, get a really good person, get a really good coach, and just let the machine build itself and let the Sam Hinkie process play out. And that's what looks like what appears to be the real playbook for sustained success. We're just not willing to wait. Like, I think every contract in the NHL as a head coach, I think every Division I school, and going back to your example with that Division III coach, I think every contract should be 5 years. No way it's going to happen. Not in our current programming, not in our current culture. But if you think you have, and everyone says it, air quotes, everyone thinks they have their guy in their press conference. The GMs are like, this is my guy. It's my ride or die. Love this guy. And then in 2 years, you're tired of him and you're not integrous because you just kick him to the curb. He's not your guy unless you're willing, hot take. He's not your guy unless you're willing to give him 5 years. I'll kick it to you.
That is that's a good little measuring stick to use that I think you and I could both put money on not happening anytime soon. Although I do agree, like if this is blank person is really the person to take over this program, organization, team, and bring them to the levels that you think they're capable of, give them 5 years. Give them 5 years. And you as owner, GM, whoever's hiring, I joked about this last time on the podcast. I want you to hire that person. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to go to sleep for 5 years and wake them up, and we'll let you know how it went. And I will say, in case this has all sounded doom and gloom, I will say that there are a lot of positive examples of teams doing this and having a lot of success. You just brought up Pittsburgh. We've talked about Colorado. We've mentioned Tampa. Detroit's going to get there. In Division I, look at Quinnipiac. They just won the national championship in 2023. Like that coaching staff has largely been there for years. For sure, head coach, but even some of the assistants have been there for a long time without really much turnover at all. Look at Denver winning this year, and they won it, whatever, I think it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago as well. So they've had a lot of sustained success within short periods of time from not changing, from having a guy like David Carl there as an assistant for however many years, I think 4 or 5, maybe more, before he took over as head coach. Like it can be done, and you are seeing it done on the big stages of Division I and NHL. And I'm sure, like, you and I don't follow it, or I certainly don't, but like CHL, whether that's OQ, WHL, like um, I'm sure it is happening there too to some degree, and guys are having success like that and able to sustain it. But I guess my point is like, I think in some ways, in I think in some ways, people like you and I are also not allowing enough time on the feedback loop and are want to see it happen overnight. We want to see every NHL team start using the Tampa blueprint or the Detroit blueprint. And you do need to give NHL teams or just the industry time to recognize, like, in 10 years, you're going to look back and think, who were the dynasties of the mid 2000s or the early 2020s? And it's like Pittsburgh, Colorado, Tampa. What do they all have in common? Oh, they brought up their AHL coach to the head coach. Like they developed him from within. with Bednar, with Cooper, um, or they kept something compounding for years in a row. And so I think in some ways like this this stuff we're talking about will happen. It just needs more time to get there and more evidence that that is what brings success. You almost need teams like Buffalo to do something different, not have the success that a team like Detroit is going to have, ideally. And then it's like, okay, Detroit and Buffalo were in similar spots in 2024. Detroit took one path, Buffalo took another. Detroit's path led to more success. That's probably what we need to do in the future. Um, will that truly happen? I don't know, but I do have faith, honestly, that like I don't think I'm that smart. I don't think that you and I are the only people that have thought about this or realized this. I think that there are other people out there that see similar issues with the way things are currently done at the highest levels, like you said. And I do have like a general faith that there will be positive changes within the industry at the highest levels, and that some of these things we've talked about will come to fruition. And then you and compound that with like Sam Hinkie and basketball and other sports that are seeing similar success from, again, similar pathways or similar trajectories. And I guess, yeah, I have hope that I'm holding out hope that that will be more commonplace when I'm 40 and not 30.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Um, Guys, if you gained some insight or you laughed or you smiled or you liked this, share the show with someone that you know and leave us a comment if you want to. We'd love to hear from you. You can leave a comment on Spotify. I don't know if you can on Apple or not. You can DM us. We'll leave our Twitter links and we will see you on the next one.